Kwekwe bienvenue. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this ninth Dr. Dan Andreae lecture series. My name is Robert Hache. I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Laurentian University, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the event this evening. We'd like to begin our event this evening by acknowledging the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We also further recognize that Laurentian University is located on the traditional lands of the Atikamek Anishinaabe, and that the greater city of Sudbury includes the traditional lands of the Wahnapitae First Nation. As a descendant of settlers, I extend my deepest respect to all Indigenous peoples. Miigwech. Nous sommes tellement fiers ce soir de vous présenter le 8e discours dans la série du recteur des conférences distinguées, Dan Andreae, pour vivre dans les collectivités en bonne santé. This 8th lecture, correcting myself from earlier, in this series falls on a special year. Laurentian University, founded in 1960, began celebrating its 60th anniversary in March of this year. As Northern Ontario's first university, Laurentian started as a modest federation of universities that has matured into an outstanding research-intensive, nationally and globally impactful institution. This past spring, however, the pandemic required that we act quickly and that we put the health and safety of our community first. For this reason, we have had to postpone this evening's event from its originally scheduled date in March. I am also so pleased to welcome you here all this evening in this virtual reality as we proceed with this wonderful event. Despite the challenges we face as a community during these difficult times, we must celebrate the hopeful resilience of our community, our students, our staff and faculty, our retirees, our alumni, who continue to weather through this crisis, turning our gaze towards the next 60 years of our university and to the next many years in their own lives. Important discussions like the ones taking place tonight must continue, and I am very proud that we've been able to pivot to make this happen. Welcome, Mr. Burke. Thrilled to have you with us, Mr. Brock, and welcome back, Dr. Pegoraro. Having been thinking often throughout the pandemic about our extended Laurentian community that we are so lucky to have, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the more than 66,000 Laurentian alumni who are having an impact around the world and contributing to making our university a destination of choice. We are represented in over 75 countries throughout the world, and our alumni move mountains for us and continue to do so, even under our current circumstances. In the same vein, I'd like to extend thanks to our friends who are part of the Laurentian University community and their generous support, which has made the Dr. Dan Andreae Distinguished Presidential Lecture Series on Living in Healthy Communities possible for so many years. Ces conférences représentent une occasion importante pour les citoyens et citoyennes de la ville du Grand Sudbury, en plus des étudiants, des professeurs et des membres du personnel de l'université. Living in healthy communities is a theme that informs our scholarship, our dedicated research, and our strategic goals at Laurentian. It is a theme that is embodied through our programs, schools, student supports, and research initiatives, including the School of Rural and Northern Health, the School of Social Work, the School of Human Kinetics, the Center for Research in Occupational Safety and Health, en sciences infirmières, and in nursing, dans les programmes Sage-Femme and in the midwifery program, through Indigenous Studies and the Indigenous Social Work Program, and through many projects involving the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. Health within community reaches much farther, however, than our personal health. Through the building of the Living with Lake Center, a global center of excellence in restoration and conservation ecology, we have produced cutting-edge research that is essential to the well-being of our planet. Dr. Andrea's leadership in the field of social work has contributed to shaping important public policy in Ontario. His community involvement includes being the first executive director of the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto and the chair of the Patrons Council of the Society, from which he recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award. He was also the longest-serving president of the Ontario Association of Social Workers. He has been recognized with a long list of awards and honors, including the Ontario Medal of Good Citizenship, the Distinguished Teaching Award at the University of Waterloo, two-time recipient of the Faculty of the Year Award, and a recipient of the Faculty Mentoring Award at the University of Guelph, Humber, And finally, Dr. Andreae was selected as the Professor of the Decade by the International Association of Top Professionals in New York for 2020. And recently this spring was awarded the International Hero Award for Higher Education, also awarded by the International Association of Top Professionals. Well done, Dan. We are always so pleased to welcome you here at Laurentian. Thank you again for your commitment to Laurentian and your investments in our students and our community. Please, everyone on the line, let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Andreae. Merci tout le monde. Miigwech. Thank you, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of the evening.
Dan, you've got to unmute.
Okay now?
Perfect. We got you now.
Thank you. President, most of you want me to keep quiet most of the time, so thank you for making it possible to speak. President Haché, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. Merci pour être avec nous ce soir. We're thrilled to have three exceptional individual speakers who are indeed champions, advocates, and educators for inclusion in sport. I don't think we could have assembled a more knowledgeable and better group of panelists for the themes in tonight's discussion. Now, we have watched and admired both Brian and Brock, who exemplify the practice of inclusion in sport in their work, in their personal lives, and in their careers. And also, we've seen the same kind of commitment and passion for inclusion by Laurentian alumna and Pegoraro, who inspires her students who will one day become part of the sports industry. So I want to thank our wonderful panelists for their time, experience, and the insights that they're going to share with us tonight. And I'm also very pleased to welcome tonight's moderator and good friend, Steve Paikin. Now, most of you know Steve because he is the host of TV Ontario's flagship current affairs program, The Agenda with Steve Paikin, which is really the gold standard, okay, for in-depth analysis and insightful and thoughtful debate in the Canadian media. Now, in October 2013, he became an educational ambassador and was appointed Chancellor of Laurentian University in Sudbury, and he gives tremendous amounts of time to the university, and I know that he is loved by the faculty, the students, and the community. Now, Steve was named an Officer of the Order of Canada for his many contributions as a journalist and author, for his engaging, informative, and educational seminars and presentations, and really on a broad range of different public policy issues. And he's also previously, in I think 2014, made a member of the Order of Ontario. So I'm very pleased, Steve, that you are here tonight as a champion and a great sports fan, I know that, and also along with our three panelists. So Steve, welcome.
Well, you know that you and I are both massive sports fans because a year ago, you and I went to a game at the place I still like to call the Sky Dome. And I think amidst the baseball game, Dan, you and I probably threw more trivia questions at each other of more arcane sports stuff. And I guess I really need to know that original Six poster you've got in the background there. Yeah. Now, is that there all the time, or did you just put that up for tonight?
No, that's been there for years, actually, Steve. You know,
I'm very impressed.
Okay, thank you.
Very, very impressed at your commitment. Anyway, needless to say, Dan, well, two things. Number one, we all admire the commitment you've made to this lecture series. We're obviously disappointed that we couldn't make it happen in person, but we're very glad to be able to recreate it right now. And so thank you for that. And also, needless to say, I can't wait until we can get back to the ballpark and go to another game together, because you're a great guy to go to a game with.
Oh, you are too.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just take a second here and talk to you about our format for tonight. We have three terrific guests, as you've heard. We're going to give them an opportunity to present individually, opening statements if you like, and then we're going to have a bit of a moderated discussion by yours truly. And of course, we'll save lots of time at the end for questions. If you go to the bottom of your screen, I'm delighted to see we've got 188 participants already, which would be the biggest Zoom feed I've ever been on, that's for sure. You can see in the middle of the bottom of your screen that Q&A icon. Just click on that and type in your questions, and then when the time is right, we will get to those questions. We'll just go through as many as we can. And I promise we'll have you out of here by about 11:30, 12 o'clock, midnight, something like that. Okay. And I should say one more thing. This is a Zoom feed, and I think we've all become acquainted over the last many months with the fact that, bandwidth isn't the same everywhere, and the screen at various times may freeze up. We may have difficulties with audio. We're just going to roll with it, right? We'll do the best we can. And with that, I am delighted to start our introductions. Our first presenter tonight, I've only met him once, actually. He was a guest on the agenda a few years ago, and guess what we talked about? Strangely enough, not hockey. We actually talked business because even though he is a Stanley Cup champion, he's also a guy who's distinguished himself as a successful business executive. Former president of the Calgary Flames, former manager of the Stanley Cup champion Anaheim Ducks, former president and manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Brian is different, and there aren't too many graduates of Harvard Law in the NHL, and Brian is. Professional sports isn't exactly one of the most gay-positive institutions in our society, but Brian is. He's been a champion against homophobia in sports, and now you're going to find out why. So let's welcome the pride of Providence, Rhode Island. Here's Brian Burke, everybody.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for the kind words. Hello, everybody. President Hache, thank you for having us, and Dr. Dan, thanks for putting this all together many years ago. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my story, and some of it you might know, some of it you might not. I was not an activist in this space until 10 years ago, roughly, when my son came out. So my son, Brendan, went to the University of Miami. They used to call it Miami of Ohio, but it's now Miami University. And he was a student manager on the hockey team. And he came out to his family. And then he came out very publicly on national television in Canada, and with our full support and backing. And so that's when I became a convert to the cause. Before that, I can say I was not homophobic. Our household was not homophobic. I didn't have to take anything back, which is a problem for some parents when their son or daughter comes out. We were raised in a house that taught acceptance and inclusion. And so it was a non-event in our house, but I became an activist after that. And then shortly after that, Brendan was killed in a car accident. He was driving back to a hockey game at Miami in a blizzard in Indiana, and had a car accident and was killed along with another young man that was in the car with him. So that became that day for our family. We said we can either sit and mope, or we can, keep marching ahead and make sure Brendan's legacy continues. So we started You Can Play, which is a family charity, and it's if you can play on our team, you can play. If you're good enough to help our team win, doesn't matter what church you go to, doesn't matter who you go home with at night. If you can play, you can play. And we continue to, 10 years later, this is the 10th anniversary of Brendan's death this year. And 10 years later, we continue to make strides in this space. So my message when I talk to groups about this is today, I'm going to ask you to take 3 steps. Okay, so when we talk to groups about this, I can't stand, for example, people who say, well, I support women's hockey, and then I go to the games and there's 50 people there. You support people, if you support women's hockey, buy tickets, go to the games. The same thing here. People say, well, of course, I support the LGBTQ community. And I say, okay, then there's positive steps you can take. So number one, and I give a similar speech to high schools. When I talk to high schools, say, take 3 steps. So number one, everyone agree we're going to practice inclusion and acceptance, not tolerance. I hate when people say, we've got to teach tolerance. You tolerate cats. You tolerate light rain when you're walking without a jacket. That's what you tolerate. You accept these people into our lives. So we're going to practice acceptance and inclusion in our homes, in our workplace, starting today, everybody. And people say, well, we do that. No, you don't. You let that joke be told and you don't say anything. And it's okay, because you don't want to be a pain in the butt at work, but not where I work. Those jokes aren't okay. Racial jokes aren't okay. Homophobic jokes aren't okay. So number one is we're going to practice and teach inclusion and acceptance and diversity in our homes and in our workplaces. So that's number one. And in the workplace, I'm not talking about just not tolerating comments that are made. I'm talking about an active, inclusive policy on hiring and promotions. And the 2 best companies in Canada for this are Toronto Dominion and IBM. They have years ago set the standard and say, we are going to be known as a workplace that is not only accepting of this community, but inclusive of this community and welcoming to this community. They set the gold standard so that they promote people without regard to these things. There's no bias, there's no stigma. So that's one thing too. So the workplace is very important. The second is I'm going to ask you to take an active step on behalf of this community. So write a check to You Can Play, or join PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. Join the Gay Straight Alliance. Like, take a positive step that said, go to a pride parade. You know, join all these things that I think are really important. I hope the day comes when we don't have pride parades, when we don't need that community to say, here, we're important, we count, stop treading on us, stop treating us this way. I hope we get to a point where we're so inclusive, we don't have that. We have one parade every year that celebrates all peoples, and there's gay floats in the parade. There's LGBTQ floats in the parade, but not a gay parade. But take an affirmative step today. Resolve that you're going to make a difference and take a positive step in your life to support the LGBTQ community. And number 3 is be vigilant on behalf of this community going forward. You've got to vote for people that are actively in support of this community. You've got to do business with businesses that are actively in support of this community. I bank at TD, right? I bank at TD for a reason. It's because I believe they have the interests of the LGBTQ community at heart. I vote only for candidates who are in favor of inclusivity, diversity, and acceptance. So I live my life by those principles. I shop by those principles. I buy things by those principles. I form my friendships by those principles. So be vigilant on behalf of this community. If everyone does the things I'm talking about, things will get dramatically better for the LGBTQ community. Now, I talk to people and they say, why should I care about this? I don't have any gay relatives. I got no dog in this fight. Brian Burke, you have a dog in this fight because your son was gay. But even if you can't do it on the grounds of human decency, and there are many people who don't, you got to remember these biases, this bigotry, this ignorance, this hatred accumulated over centuries. These are not doors we are going to kick in. It's dramatically better to be a young gay man in Canada today than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But we're nowhere near where we have to be. So we know these walls are made of mud and they're thick and they're going to crumble over time. These are not doors you kick in. But the simple fact of the matter is we can move toward these things. And if you can't see it as a decent human being, then think of it this way. The cost to society in Canada of oppression of the LGBT community is staggering. LGBTQ youth are 14 times more likely to take their own lives than straight kids, 14 times. The amount of time that's lost due to depression for people who are struggling with coming out, battling their identity, is staggering. So if you can't get there as a decent human being, get there on the basis that as a Canadian, this bigotry, this bias, this oppression costs you millions of dollars every year, and it puts youth at risk. I do work for Covenant House in Toronto. It's a homeless shelter, right? And I have no interest in like, you can only do so much work, right? So I've got my causes I work for. Homeless people isn't one of them. You know why I'm active with Covenant House? 40% of their people that are there on a homeless basis, on a temporary basis, are members of the LGBTQ community whose parents threw them out of their house. That's why I'm interested in Covenant House. The cost to Canada is staggering. So if you can't get there as a decent human being should, get there because you don't want to pay the cost of this oppression, this bigotry, this bias, this ignorance. That's my opening statement. I'm worked up about this.
Brian, you've got us off to a brilliant start. Thank you so much for those comments. It's my pleasure now to welcome former OHL and professional hockey player Brock McGillis. Brock played goal for the Windsor Spitfires, the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, and the Kalamazoo Wings. He is the first openly gay professional hockey player in history. He has become an influential advocate for the LGBTQ community. He speaks at schools, corporations, conferences, provides inclusivity training for companies. His story's been highlighted in media across North America. He's been featured in the book Everyday Hockey Heroes, been on CBC News, The National, CTV's Your Morning, on the cover of In Magazine. And finally, Brock, I got to tell you, I am jealous of that name. I'm just trying to think, if I had your name instead of Steve Paikin, if I was Brock McGillis, I'd be on CNN by now, buddy. Holy cow. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, here's Brock McGillis.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. So does that mean I can actually get on CNN? Is that my next step?
With a name like that, you can go anywhere. That's a cool athlete's name, Brock
It is.
McGillis.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I want to take you on a story, my story. I want to share it with you in an attempt to humanize the issues surrounding being a gay man in hockey. I remember being 6 years old and I was watching a movie with my parents and there was a gay character. And I said to them, what if I'm gay? And they said, if you're gay, you're gay. You're Brock. We love you. And I actually remember I went to my room and cried. That memory stuck in the back of my mind for a very long time. But it wasn't at the forefront because something else was, hockey. I loved hockey. And I became the stereotypical Canadian kid. I lived down the street from an arena in a small town outside of Série in Marks Day, Ontario. And I would go to the rink every night hoping that the ice was free, or a team from Série would show up with missing a goaltender and I can jump on the ice with them. And I literally spent all my time there. Actually, my parents would drop my meals off on weekends because I'd be at the rink. It didn't matter what level they were, what age they were, I wanted to be on the ice. And I got pretty good and I moved up to play AAA hockey, and I started to recognize that I didn't identify with what was being talked about in the locker rooms. People would speak about women and girls and different things like that, and I just didn't relate and it couldn't resonate with it. But I felt like I had to fit in, to be one of the boys, to play hockey at those levels. And then as I got older into the OHL, I began to conform to the culture. I became the stereotype of what I thought it meant to be a hockey player. I was cocky, I thought I was sweet, I walked into a room like I owned it. And everyone in my life thought I had this great life. I'd sign autographs at malls and things were going great. I'm ashamed to admit it, I was a womanizer. And everyone thought I had this pretty wonderful life and I was on NHL draft lists. But what they didn't know is I'd go home at night and I'd cry. I hated myself. I wanted to die. And on more than one occasion while I was in the OHL, I tried to take my own life. By the age of 18, I started drinking heavily to numb it, to suppress my sexuality, to suppress who I was. And from 18 to 23, I drank almost every day without anyone really knowing. I was depressed, I was suicidal, and my hockey career suffered. I went from being on NHL draft lists, supposed to have this linear trajectory to the NHL, to finally at 23, I had a season-ending injury every year and I was sitting in the minors in Europe. And I sat myself down one day. I just said, you need to figure this out, because two things were going to happen. One, my career was ending. And two, if I didn't figure out who I was probably going to end up dead. So that season ended and I came back to Série, but I went to Toronto and I went on a date with a man. And I actually ended up dating him for 3 years. And I was so relieved at first. I thought, here I was finally accepting who I was and so relieved. And I was like, this is awesome. I'm gay. I know I'm gay. Okay, my life's going to get back on track. My career, everything's going to go the way it's supposed to. But in fact, it got worse. Because now I wasn't suppressing who I was hiding it. I was in the closet. And not only was I hiding myself, but I was hiding another person, my partner. And I dated somebody for 3 years without anyone in my family knowing, without my friends knowing. And with him and his friends, we had an alias for me so they wouldn't find me on social media and expose me. And it was all out of fear that it would jeopardize any opportunity I had to play the sport of hockey. As you can imagine, that relationship ended. And shortly thereafter, I decided to take a step back from professional hockey and I moved to Montreal to go to school and focus on my education. But I decided to play on the hockey team just in case, I wanted to pursue the game further. And one night when I was there, I was watching a Leafs game on TV. And there was this young man talking between periods. And he was talking about following in his father's footsteps and making the NHL as a general manager. And this young man was Brendan Burke, Brian's son. And Brendan, you know, he was talking about that and I wasn't really fully paying attention. And then he said, and I'm gay. My ears perked up, my head swung around, and I was in shock because I had never heard anyone say that they were gay in hockey unless it was a hockey player calling another hockey player gay. And it was always used in such a negative connotation, which made me hide and hate who I was. So the hockey world's a very small place, and I reached out to Brendan that night, and we instantly, you know, became friends and talked. And it was such a relief to finally have somebody in my life who understood the duality of being a gay man and being in this hyper-masculine, macho men's hockey environment. And I think for Brendan, having somebody who understood it as well as, you know, sympathetic and supportive as family can be, or our queer friends can be and everything else, that duality is very difficult for people to relate to unless they're in it. And we talked a fair bit. And then one day I received a message from Brendan, and it was very different than any other message, you know, gone before. He just said, I can't wait for the day that you're out to your family like I am to mine. I remember looking at that and throwing my phone down. I ignored it. And it wasn't because I didn't think my family would be inclusive and supportive. In fact, I knew they would. They told me at the age of 6. But they were so involved in the hockey world. My father coached AAA and junior hockey for 30 plus years and scouted in the OHL for a long time. My brother was a first-round pick in the OHL and played professionally. And I feared that they'd become more sensitive to the language used in locker rooms and behaviors around the sport and stand up to it, and in the process accidentally out me. So I ignored that message. That ended up being the last thing Brendan ever said to me. It's 2 days later, he passed away. And I felt so alone in Montreal that I went home and I told my brother. I sat him down and I said, Corey, I'm gay. I knew I had to honor that message. And he said, yeah, so you're Brock. I love you. And then I ended up telling my parents and family and friends, but I didn't tell anyone in the hockey world. Out of fear that I would lose friendships, out of fear I'd lose opportunity. And even after I retired, I didn't tell anyone in the hockey world because I moved back to Sudbury initially. And I began working with athletes, predominantly hockey players, predominantly young men. And I feared that if these parents of these young hockey players knew I was gay in Sudbury, they wouldn't want their boys working with me. Because the reality is there isn't a ton of exposure to the LGBT plus community in Sudbury, and I just feared that it would jeopardize any opportunity I had with my training business. So I hid it. And I thought I was doing a pretty good job of it until one day I got a phone call from a hockey mom. And I have to say, hockey parents are a unique breed of human. And I would get hundreds of calls daily from these parents, but this one was a little different. I got a call from a hockey mom who said, Brock, I want to set you up on a date. I went, oh dear God, no. What am I going to tell her? What am I going to say? How am I going to get out of this? So, and I was thinking, do I tell her I'm in a relationship? But then I thought, you know what? I kind of wonder what she thinks my type is. So I said, what's her name? And she said, Steve. And I said, what? And she said, Brock, you're gay. And I said, what? And she was getting a little fed up at that point, and she started shouting, you're gay, Brock, you're gay. And I said, how do you know this? And she said, oh, my son told me. And her son was 15 at the time. She's like, he's known for years. I'm like, how does he know this? She's like, all the boys know. My heart started racing and I started panicking, and I was sitting there and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Like, they're all going to leave. None of them are going to want to work with me anymore now that they know I'm gay. And I was freaking out and my heart was racing. I'm like, how am I going to pay my bills? I thought, wait, I was this cocky hockey player who thought he was so sweet. And now I'm working with all these cocky hockey players that think they're so sweet. and they all know I'm gay and choose to work with me. In Sudbury. How cool is that? So I thought in that moment, maybe I should tell them. Maybe I should come out. But instead, I decided to do something different. I decided to do a little sociology experiment. Because I realized something. They know I'm gay, but they don't know that I know that they know that I'm gay. So I decided to observe their behaviors, almost like animals in the wild, hockey players in their natural habitat, in the gym and on the ice. And I always tried to curb racist, sexist, and homophobic language with my athletes. And I started to recognize that anytime somebody would say something homophobic, like that's so gay, or tease each other saying you're a fag, things like that, they'd freeze up and apologize to me instantly. I just sort of shrugged my shoulders and be like, it's cool. And eventually I started thinking, well, cool, maybe I'm creating a shift. Maybe I'm creating a shift in them. Maybe, you know, they're going to go out and be better people from it. Or maybe they just like me and they apologize to me, but they go on the ice and in the rink and call people fags. And the reality was I had no idea until one day I wasn't there. And I had a sprint coach working with some of my athletes on a track. And at the end of a 2-hour workout, he told them they had 10 more sprints. And one of the younger players who came from a very progressive household, his mother's dear friend of mine, father gives me a hug every time he sees me and tells me he's walking this journey with me. This young player looked at the sprint coach and said, "This is so gay, I can't believe you're making us do this." And one of my older players who was already in the OHL, you know, immersed in the culture more, looked at him and said, "We don't say that here. Give me 50 push-ups." And the younger player said, "You're right." And he dropped down and did 50 push-ups. And that was something my athletes adopted amongst themselves to kind of shift their thought process, shift that habit of using that type of language. And because hockey players, especially in Canada and in Northern Ontario, are influencers, they took it to their peers at school, they took it to their teammates on their teams, they took it everywhere with them. Like one night, the younger player, one of his teammates I've never met, was on FaceTime with a young woman. And she said, "Let's hang out." And he said, "No, I can't, I have practice." She said, "That's okay, you never want to hang out with me." And he looked at her and said, "Give me 50 push-ups right now or I'm never talking to you again." And they both dropped down and did 50 push-ups. And it dawned on me that I was creating shifts. I wasn't even out yet and I was creating shifts and I had no idea. And they were creating shifts. And I probably should have came out at that point, but quite honestly, I was afraid. I was afraid because I grew up in this hyper-masculine, macho hockey culture where I didn't think it was okay. And I thought I had to be a certain way. And I thought by coming out, I would lose friends, I would lose opportunity in coaching and training and everything else. And I was afraid. But then a few things happened that gave me the kick in the butt I needed to come out and create shifts. Shortly after that call with that mother, a hockey association up north wouldn't let my business work with their teams. I grew up playing in the hockey association. I was coaching in it for free. In fact, I was volunteering with about 7 or 8 of their teams. My father coached in the association. My brother had played and coached in the association. And all of a sudden they said that my business, training players, and I trained the majority of the top players in the city, wasn't allowed to work with any players or any of their teams in season. And mine was the only one that wasn't allowed, out of nowhere. And true to form, my father saw the president one night at a rink and looked at him and said, "Is it because Brock's gay?" And he denied knowing, even though this mother had told me people knew. I guess the president may have went around and called some people, because the next day I showed up at a rink with one of the teams I was volunteering with, and the coach told me he no longer needed my services and had my replacement there to work with his goalies. And all my fears growing up came true. And this wasn't that long ago, this is 2015. They all came true, and I'd never felt so low and resented who I was. And these were people I thought were my friends. And right after that season, there was an incident in Orlando at Pulse nightclub where 49 people were murdered for being part of the LGBTQ+ community. And the reality is, for this community, for the LGBTQ plus community, having those safe spaces like a gay bar, queer spaces are safe, because walking down the street, 2 men, 2 women, being trans in today's society, you know, still poses a lot of threat and danger. I mean, 2 men walking down the street, even in inclusive areas like Toronto, run the risk of verbal threats and violence and everything else. So those spaces are important to us. They are where we can go and be ourselves and love who we love without any fear of judgment or ridicule. And that was ripped away from us. And this was in North America. This wasn't somewhere across the world. I've had people reach out across the world. I had somebody reach out from a country where it's legal to be gay. And this person reached out to me, and his best friend had written the first LGBT newsletter in a country where it's illegal to be gay. He was found by government and decapitated. But this wasn't there. This was in our backyard. This is our neighbors to the south. And this could have easily been me and my friends in Toronto. And it really upset me. And it upset the entire community so much, it devastated us. And Pulse happened, I believe, on a Saturday night. And then the next Wednesday, I received a call from one of my best friends. He, at the time, was running Toronto Pride. And he had a charity event he was hosting that Friday night. And I was supposed to go with him. And he called me on the Wednesday and said, "Brock, I don't think you should come." And I said, "Well, that's kind of mean." I was pretty pumped and excited for it. And he said, "Well, I just received a call from the RCMP and I'm on an ISIS hit list." I said, "No, you're not. Like, this isn't funny. Pulse just happened." Like, and he's like, "No, really, they have a picture of me." And I said, "Well, are you going to the event?" He said, "Yeah." So that Friday morning, I drove from Sudbury. I didn't tell my family, and this is probably the first time they've heard this story. I drove to Toronto and met up with my friend to go to the event. And it was the first time I'd been to a charity event where they've had metal detector wands out and everyone was being patted down and we were being frisked and we had undercover officers around us. Thankfully, nothing happened, but I knew in that moment that I had to do something. So the next day I reached out to a friend of mine, Sanaya Saperji, who at the time was working for Yahoo Sports and is now with The Athletic. And I said, "Sanaya, I'm coming out." And she said, "All right, let's do it." So I wrote an article for Yahoo Sports to come out. And I thought maybe I'd empower myself a little bit and not let people use my sexuality against me. Maybe I'd help a few kids. The first day alone, I received over 10,000 messages from people all over the world. And it was the most humbling and overwhelming experience in my life. And from there, I received phone calls, media outlets, to speaking opportunities. And now, you know, I traveled the world in the last 4 years and speak all over the world. My job is as an activist, and I have a digital TV series with RuPaul's Drag Race, and things have changed immensely for me. And through all this, I've learned some things and recognized some things. I'd like to share those with all of you. First, foremost, we all have the ability to create shifts. Each and every one of us can create a shift. Whether it's a large shift or a small shift, we all have that ability. My conversations with Brendan made me realize that I could create a shift. I, without knowing it, was creating shifts in these hockey players, and they in turn were creating them in me. We all have that ability. The easiest way to create shifts, in my opinion, is through language. Language we use. And, you know, if this was an hour-long education seminar and I was, you know, going in depth, I would talk about 5 different kinds: direct language, indirect language, laughter, body language, and silence. And I'm going to focus on silence right now quickly because I think right now in today's society is probably the most important one. Silence is deafening. And we can sit here and think, well, I'm not homophobic, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist or anything else. But the reality is, if we're not standing up against them, we're allowing it to happen around us, we're complicit. And that's not okay. We must do more. We must stand up and become the anti. Anti-oppression is the only way that we will shift society. And the other thing I've realized, and most importantly, and if you take one thing away from anything I've said tonight, please remember this. I've come to the realization that there's this idea of normal that we all have when we want to fit in and conform in society, and I did in hockey. But normal doesn't exist. Normal is a fallacy, it's an illusion, it's fake. Look around you. Everyone in your life, everyone in this Zoom right now, we all have different hair color, eye color, body shape, sizes, skin color. They have different thoughts, dreams, goals, ambitions. Normal is a fallacy. All of us, we are all a bunch of weirdos. And that is such a beautiful thing. And when each of us learn to embrace our own weirdness and accept that we are weirdos, we are going to be less likely to judge everyone else for theirs. Thank you.
Outstanding, Brock. Thank you very much for that. Let's introduce Anne Pegoraro. Now, had we been doing this earlier this year, when we were supposed to be doing this earlier this year, I would have been happy to introduce Anne as the director of the Institute for Sport Marketing and the professor in the School of Human Kinetics at Laurentian University. But a funny little thing happened shortly after that. And Anne is now the Lang Chair in Sport Management at the University of Guelph, although she still hangs out in Sudbury. And we're delighted to hand her the microphone right now. Dr. Anne, it's all over to you.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to be the typical academic and share my screen and my sound and share some slides. So hopefully you can all see those. I'm going to take us through a little bit of what the current state of inclusion in Canadian sport is and what do we know about it and how could we do this, the title of today, how do we make the play to make it more inclusive? And so I think of some of the words of great leaders like Nelson Mandela when he talked about sport and some of the things that Brock and Brian have already said, that sport has the power to change the world, to inspire us, to unite people in a way that little else does. And I think importantly in our discussion tonight, sport talks to youth, and that's probably where we're trying to get our message to today. Interestingly, Canadians believe in the power of sport. 92% of us believe the community-based sport have the positive influence in the lives of our youth. So we believe sport can make change and can influence our youth to positive things. What do we really know about the benefits of sport? So because I'm a researcher, I always go to the research. You're going to see a lot of that today. This graphic shows a lot of the benefits that have been studied in multiple studies over the year of the lifespan of an individual and how sport can play a positive role. And besides the things we know about being physically active and what that does in terms of your health, people who participate in sport are perform better in school, 50% more likely to go to college, have higher annual earnings, are more productive in the workforce. And then of course, these long-term benefits around health and reduced risk for certain diseases. But importantly, if you're healthy and active throughout your lifespan, when you start to have children, you'll influence them. And the more active we are as parents, the more likely those children will be active, and this cycle keeps moving forward. So there's lots of benefits that we get from being in sport. Particularly for women and girls, sport participation gives us all these healthy and confidence building aspects of it. It's even more important for girls in racial minority groups. And then outside of sport, in terms of our career trajectories, we see that 74% of women in business have a background in sport. They're in management positions. And if you go to the top level of business, in the C-suites, the CEOs and the CMOs, 94% of those women who make it there have played sport. What are some things we know about us as Canadians? So as we start to look at why we would care about diversity and inclusion in sport, let's talk a little bit about who we are as a society. And so if I look at the 2016 census data, 1 in 4 Canadians are BIPOC. Inside that group are 1.7 million Indigenous people, and women are topping the majority scale at almost 51% of the population. Depending on what you look like for surveys and self-identification, between 3 to 13% of Canadians self-identify as LGBTQ. Why does this matter? What do we need to know about sport and its role it plays? This is a selection of articles that appeared in the last 12 to 18 months in news talking about some of the key issues around hate, homophobia, racism, and misogyny in sport. So we need to understand this to be able to get those benefits from sport. What do we know about the current state of what's going on in terms of homophobia and transphobia? I think we've heard some great personal stories. Let me tell you some of the things that people have shared more anonymously in research. This is a very large study that compared Canada to 7 other countries around the world. And we found that in the Canadian sample, the data I'll show you here is that 81% of participants had witnessed or experienced homophobia. And in fact, interestingly, 66% of people felt that an openly gay person wouldn't be safe in the spectator sport events. So those baseball games you were talking about, Steve, not necessarily safe at times for spectators who are openly gay. When we talk about gay men and lesbians themselves in sport, let's talk a little bit of what's happened to them. Overwhelmingly, the majority of them have been targeted by verbal slurs, the things that Brock was telling about that he heard in his lifespan. Also, we look at things beyond verbal threats and physically assaulted. So safe sport isn't really safe for LGBTQ individuals. And interestingly, it's not just out women and men who are targeted, but actually straight men who are targeted if they appear gay or are targeted and emasculated with words around gay slurs. 70% of the people that responded to this said, while I still played sports as youth growing up, they don't think it's a safe place for gay people. And you all think to yourself, oh, I don't know if I've had a gay teammate, right? You've heard Brock's story. The majority of gay men and lesbians in sport either have one foot or both foot in the closet because it's not a safe place for them. So when you don't think you have a gay teammate, you actually probably do. I think shocking for me was this, that 64% of the people that responded to this survey believe that sport is actually more homophobic than the rest of society. So we need some change. When we look at trans athletes, it's even worse. The trans athletes, the limited studies we have to date, and we're just starting to build this sort of literature, is that the majority, if not all of them, have witnessed some sort of abuse, and it goes all the way from verbal to physical to sexual assault. And in that same survey that I mentioned earlier, Canadians versus all the other countries in the world were 2 times more likely to say that physical education classes are the least safe place for LGBTQ youth. So think about that when you send your kids to school every day. So that's what we know about homophobia and transphobia. But being inclusive in sport is a bigger issue than that if we want to take this full on. So what do we know about the state around racial and gender equity inside Canadian sport? First place I'll take you back to again is the census data from 2016. And we have to address the fact there's a growing gap between the positive benefits we talked about that our kids can get from sport, but what they're actually experiencing. And this has to do with what the census tells us about household income. Household income has been shown in research to be one of the most important or the most important predictor of whether a child will take part in organized sport. And in Canada, white families have 32% more wealth and roughly 20% higher income than other races. So it's no wonder that when you take a look at sport, it looks like this. This is Hockey Canada's board 1 year ago, and these are the words from their annual report. The members of Hockey Canada Board of Directors come from all walks of life and from all corners of the country. They are the custodians of the game. I think there's many people in our audience tonight would think that this does not represent all walks of life in Canada. I am happy to say that Hockey Canada did realize that they have a diversity and inclusion situation and just recently announced new members of their board, adding 3 women and 1 man of color to the board. This summer, when Black Lives Matter rose again with the death and murder of George Floyd, CBC Sports took a real dive into the Canadian sports system to tell us what's the situation in terms of BIPOC individuals in Canada. Looking at our COC and our top level board of the 17 members, 16 of them are white, 1 is a person of color. Out of the members of boards, like I just showed you from Hockey Canada, across our biggest sport organizations in this country, swimming, athletics, hockey, skating, basketball, volleyball, out of the 100 board members I looked at, 7 were BIPOC. And these organizations represent thousands of athletes in our country. When you look at the CFL, and CBC took a look, 10% of the league positions were BIPOC, including 2 Black head coaches. If you've ever watched the CFL game, that's a massively different representation than what you see on the field. And then CBC also took us into the realm of youth sports, Canadian university sports, looking at athletic directors and top coaching positions across 56 universities in Canada, finding only 10% of Black people or BIPOC people in leadership positions. If you look at any university in Canada, one of the top things they'll tell you in their statements is they're about diversity and inclusion, and yet they don't see it inside of their sporting world. Only 1 of 56 schools had a non-white athletic director. Recently in Ontario, inside of our own sport organizations, there is a task force that took a look at how does Ontario sports go against the rest of the country from what CBC looked like. And if you can see this inside OUA football, there's 11 universities in Ontario that offer football. All of them have white head coaches. Shifting a bit, let's talk about gender. Recently, Canadian Women in Sport did a massive study, 10,000 households across Canada they interviewed to figure out what's the state of sport participation for women and girls in Canada. If you can see this graph here, we see a continued decline for girls. And I'd like you to keep remembering those benefits, and particularly the ones that women experience lifelong from participating in sport. By the age of 16, 1 in 3 girls have dropped out of sport, while at the same age, only 1 of 10 boys have. And women in my age group, 16 to 63, only 82% of us don't participate in any sport at all anymore. When you consider breaking that down by ethnic groups, CWS found in their survey that the Indigenous girls report their lowest participation rate at 24%. So again, missing out on those key benefits as they look at lifelong achievement. Switching to leadership positions for women, looking at board positions, this is the yearly snapshot that Canadian Women in Sport does. So we see that 39% of those board members that I showed you, except for Hockey Canada, now they're in this group, are women. 28% of board chairs are women. So not bad representation. Gets better when we look into CEOs of Canadian sport organizations, 42% are women. And then we delve into direct reports being 47%. So we see that there's better gender representation inside institutions. But we were remiss if we didn't talk about intersectionality. All of us have many layers to who we are every single day, and we take those with us into our jobs, into our sports, into our community. And it's gender, class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and all of these layers work together. And unfortunately, when you put lots of them together, it actually heightens discrimination. So discrimination has been found to be much greater for Black and minority ethnic and LGBTQ+ women. So if we put all these layers together inside sport, we're seeing that there are groups that are going to face the largest parts of discrimination. And why is this important to understand? Because we really will not see a change. Research has shown that we don't see a change in an organization until 30% is either women or racially diverse groups in boards, and inclusion LGBTQ across of it. So we need to have that diversity. And if you don't believe this and you don't believe in some of the things that Brian and Barack have both said today, let's talk about the business side of this. If you have a gender diverse organization, you're 21% more profitable. If you have an ethnic diversity in your team at your organization, you're 33% more profitable. So if you don't care about it from a social justice point of view, hopefully I'll appeal to you maybe caring about it from a profitability point of view. So we'll get to this point where we're sitting tonight. How do we as a group, how do we make this play to build inclusive sport in Canada? And I go back and I think about the words from Martin Luther King, and he says, I can never be what I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. And so what that speaks to me is this starts with us, each one of us thinking about being an ally, and how do we as an individual participate in the system to make the change. I think what you heard tonight is an example of what research has showed to us. Why do people become allies? And when we looked at it from the LGBTQ+ situation, it's either I have a personal relationship with somebody who's LGBTQ, or in my core value system, I believe in justice and civil rights are a big part and essential to our society. I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about allyship and what's happened in recent times in terms of real versus performative allyship. These are a couple of great graphics that share this with you. This summer, I think we saw a lot of performative allyship. Black Lives Matters, we saw it from sports teams and some of their statements. We saw it from some individuals in society. So this is all happening. It's a bandwagon. I should jump on it. I should put hashtag Black Lives Matters out there when I'm talking about things. I should put a black box up on Blackout Tuesday. And some of the things you got to take a look at yourself about why you're doing it. Are you doing it because everybody else is doing it? Are you doing it because someone called you out because you weren't doing it? Are you personally benefiting or situating or centering yourself in it? Then that's what we would call performative allyship. If we want real allyship, and that's what I'm thinking we're here to talk about tonight, if you want to be authentic, we need to start with examining our own privilege. I'm a white woman. I have privilege. I need to start from examining what that offers me in society. Educate yourself. Think about taking risks and holding yourself and others accountable. Most importantly, we all have to get uncomfortable. And if I'm making some of you uncomfortable tonight, then that's the goal. If you're uncomfortable with what you see it's happening in our sports system, if you're uncomfortable when Brock told his story or Brian talked about his son, that's the beginning of change. We need to get uncomfortable so we can move things forward. Smith gives us sort of 3 great steps to being an ally. You need to start with those relationships we talked about. You need to then move into what Brian's talked about earliest, which is acting. We need advocacy and we need to take action. You need to join in pride parades. You need to give your money. And then at the end, you have to do what we're doing here tonight, is holding each other accountable, but also holding sport and society accountable to building justice and inclusion. CWS, after their study, showed us how can we do this particularly for girls if we're talking about it, centering girls in your decision and women about how you build sport, and thinking about yourself and educate about the uniqueness of being a girl or a woman playing sport. If we want to talk about how we can do it for LGBTQ plus individuals, first thing starts with, I think, what Brock was talking about. We need to change our language, and we need to get rid of these slurs and the humor and the laughter around being gay. And we need to think about ways to build inclusive sport. And the first thing you got to do is think, this locker room, this team needs to be a safe space. Because remember, you may not know if there's a gay teammate because most of them are too afraid to tell you. Then there's lots of great existing organizations out there. He for She for gender equality from the UN's great organization. You can bring a local chapter, you can bring it into your organization. We heard tonight about You Can Play and what Brian's family's done with that. And Athlete Alley is another one. Recently, we've seen the rise of some organizations in Canada, such as the Black Coaches, Canadian Coaches Association, and the BIPOC Task Force for OUA Sports. All of these organizations are important so that we can move forward and we can become true allies in sport. And why would you want to do it? Because I'm going to show you what a true ally in sport does.
Southern California's soccer team walks off the field during a match after an opposing player allegedly uses an anti-gay slur. As Eyewitness News reporter Carlos Granda tells us, the team's action and their head coach are being praised even though they had to forfeit the game.
All right, folks, San Diego is walking off the field.
This is the moment the San Diego Loyal team makes a statement and leaves the pitch, deciding to forfeit the match. They were leading 3-1.
We have to speak and we have to act.
Manager Landon Donovan says during last night's match, a player from the Phoenix Rising team said an anti-gay slur directed at midfielder Colin Martin. Martin is an openly gay player.
When I heard that, I lost it.
And this is the discussion Donovan had with the manager of the other team, asking him to pull that player before the second half.
We have to get this out of our game. Calling a player gay? It's not racism. Calling him gay. It's homophobia. How long have you been playing soccer?
And that's when Donovan decided to pull his team off the field.
They were very clear in that moment that they were giving up all hopes of making the playoffs, even though they were beating one of the best teams in the league handedly. But they said it doesn't matter. There's things more important in life, and we have to stick up for what we believe in.
Donovan says his team was already distraught after an incident last week. During that match, a player for the Galaxy 2, Omar Ontiveros, used the N-word against loyal player Elijah Martin.
To watch the solidarity of the team, I'm like, this is the world I want to live in. Like,
A.T. Faruya is from GLSEN, an organization which works to ensure LGBTQ students are free from harassment.
To see someone utilize their power and position to send a message is really important, and also sends a message to everybody else who are fans, who participate in sports.
Junior Flemings is the player accused of using the slur. In a statement, he denies he said it. At no point did I say a homophobic slur towards Colin Martin. I do not know Colin personally, but I respect all of my opponents equally, Colin included. And Colin Martin also sent out a tweet saying, ultimately, I hope this can be another example that we have a long way to go in educating ourselves and kicking hate out of the game. Meanwhile, the manager of the Phoenix Rising Football Club issued a statement saying he does not excuse any homophobic behavior from any of his players. The team and the league say they are now investigating the incident.
Southern California soccer.
So when I think about this, I'll end with, again, some words from Martin Luther King. In the end, we'll not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So as Brock said, it's time to speak up, speak out. It's time to act like Brian said. And if we do all these things together, we'll create a more inclusive sport for Canadians. Thanks.
And thank you so much. Boy, Dr. King had a lot of good things to say, didn't he?
He sure did.
He sure did. Okay, we are now going to move to the moderated part of our discussion here, and I'd like to remind everybody about the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. If you'd like to get into the queue and put some questions in there, we're going to talk for a few minutes here, and then we'll get to your questions and take as many as we possibly can. I know we were up over 200 participants for a bit there, so it's a good message. It's an important message, and I'm glad that we've got a lot of people listening. Let's do some follow-up questions here. Brian, Burke, there are probably, 700 pro hockey players in the National Hockey League. Do you think the NHL is ready? Because presumably, if everything we are hearing tonight, presumably somebody in that crowd is gay. Is the league ready to have that person come out of the closet?
Well, first off, you guys all see why I speak before Brock and not after.
He's a hard act to follow.
Yes. Yeah, I think first off, there are gay players in our league. Statistically, there have to be. So if you use low estimates or the highest estimate somewhere, there's still somewhere 6-7%. It has to be gay. We've had gay players. We have them now. And people say they wish the guy was comfortable enough to come out, but I think Brock will back me up on this. The gay guys I know that refuse to come out, it was usually a close family member that they were worried about their reaction. Either a parent or their favorite uncle who said, I don't like gay people, they're all going to hell. It was a family personal issue. I've never had the sense that it would cost me sponsors or I might get ridiculed. But the answer is yes. I'm disappointed that I'm no longer working for teams. I wish I'd been the first team to hire, to have an openly gay player. I wish I'd been the first GM to take certain steps that are being taken now that I wish I had done. So yeah, I think the world's ready for that player. I think he will find he's greeted with open arms.
If I may say, though, and I'll do a quick follow-up with you, you are an unusually progressive person on this issue. I have heard other managers, coaches say we couldn't handle the distraction in the dressing room. That's how it's been described. Is that a fact? Would it be a distraction in the dressing room?
That's such a cop-out. That's such a cowardly thing to say. You can't judge your athletes in advance and say they're not ready for that. They are ready for that. I've never had an athlete. So this is 10 years now since Brendan came out. This is not 1 year or 2 years. This is 10 years. In those 10 years, never once have I heard anyone say what you just said. I know they say it, Steve. I'm not doubting it's been said, but not to me. And I know that from talking to the general managers and coaches in the league, it's just not a factor anymore. We are progressing as a society. We will solve some of these other social justice issues now, especially now after the election. But we've evolved as a society. Look at this past week. Kim Ng, first female general manager in pro sports history at the major league level. So major league manager, brilliant lady. She's worked at this for 20 plus years, eminently qualified. That's groundbreaking. That's a seismic shift. You look at Brett Peterson, who's just named assistant GM of the Florida Panthers, first African-American to be at the assistant GM level. That's seismic. These are important things. We're getting there. We're just not getting there fast enough to suit me.
And what's your view on the Kim Ng hiring by the Miami Marlins? How much does that move the yardsticks in your view?
I think it's important because now we see, we have a lot of debates about whether women are experienced or capable to do these jobs inside men's sports. So I think it does move. It's certainly created a great ripple effect. But, I'm kind of going to be honest and say I'll be happy when we're not celebrating firsts anymore. We're not having, because that to me means we're really moving towards inclusion. So if we're not celebrating the first woman or the first gay player, that to me is real progress. But I still say I'll between Kamala Harris and Ng's hiring, I think lots of glass all over the place as the ceilings were shattered.
2020 might be remembered for more than just COVID, in other words.
Yes.
Brock, if you referred to this in your talk, I missed it, but I don't think you did. How much counseling did you need, or what kind of resources did you have to draw on in order to deal with all of what you ran into as you considered coming out of the closet?
Well, I didn't want to tell anyone, so I didn't have any. I was afraid to tell people. I was afraid it would jeopardize any opportunity I had in the game. And to Brian's point, I do believe that the game has evolved in theory and in thought. I just don't think their actions necessarily equate to the same, and I think that's where we need to progress is, the language, the behaviors, the actions have to equal the thought processes. But I didn't want to tell anyone, because then if somebody knew, I could be exposed, and that could jeopardize opportunities. So I numbed with alcohol, substances. I tried to deal with it on my own. And it was the loneliest existence you can imagine.
Brian, you pointed out that during the course of your career, you have either presumed or known that there were gay athletes who were in the league. Did you ever feel that there was a moment where you could have a very candid conversation with somebody back when you were a manager for a team, and how you might have handled that situation?
Well, when your son tells you he's gay, it kind of equips you to handle that discussion with any other man on the planet. If you can say, I mean, what I said to Brendan was, "Are you sure?" Because I was caught totally flat-footed. I had no inkling. And I said, "Are you sure?" Because there's a questioning period some people go through. He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, Brendan, you've given us a million reasons to love you. This doesn't change one of them." He told his brother Patrick when they were moving a couch. And he said to Patrick, "I'm gay." And Patrick said, "Fine, pick up the couch." Like it was a non-event in our household. And so if a player had come to me and said, "I'm gay," I'd say, "Okay, first off, have you come out to your family and friends? What do you want to do? How do you want to handle this? Do you want to come out?" Like when Brendan told me he wanted to come out, I said, "Brendan, you're part of a team. Now, if this is going to be a distraction for the team, you talk to the coach and we'll wait and do it at the end of the year. I'll be there when you do it. I love you. I'm proud of you. But you're part of a team. You got to think of the impact on your team." And the coach was Rico Blasi, and he hugged Brendan and said, "Come out tomorrow." The team was great about it. But to me, once your son tells you he's gay, or your daughter, you can handle that conversation with another athlete pretty easily. And what I would have said to that athlete, "Okay, I'm glad you felt enough trust in me to tell me. Now what do we do? What would you like to do next? Where do we go with this?"
Brock, could I get you to amplify a bit on the last answer where you talked about what you think would happen if a National Hockey League player today came out? How accepted do you think that player would be within the game?
Well, I'll start off by taking it back to younger players, junior level, minor sports, and the kids who come to me on a regular basis who are quitting still today because of behaviors and language of coaches, of teammates, and different people, and they're struggling. I get kids coming to me on a daily basis in and out of the sport who are struggling, who are suicidal, who are have mental health struggles, who I'm finding, resources for in their local communities. And so when you take that into account and then they quit, a lot of them aren't getting there. But the ones who do, I think, it'll be a big story. And that's fine. So what? Do you know how many big stories there are in sport culture? I mean, like we look at, and this isn't a negative by any means, but Craig Anderson's wife had cancer last year or the year before. And that got so much media attention. Did the Ottawa Senators sit there and go, "Well, this is a distraction, we should cut Craig Anderson"? No. And but they still see this as a distraction. They still see the negatives. I mean, I used to, 20 OHL teams would call me every year on my athletes prior to coming out and to find out who they should draft or who's looking good from Northern Ontario, et cetera. And when I came out, it dropped to like 5.
Well, can I push back a little bit on the example you gave? Because clearly, in much of society, there is a big difference between being stricken with cancer and being gay. One is, the acceptance level and the understanding level of people who are fighting cancer is completely different, not completely, but significantly different than for those who are dealing with issues of whether to come out or not. Would you grant that?
Yeah, well, without a doubt. But my point is more that if we're talking, the distraction is the media attention. Regardless of what it is, it's going to garner a lot of attention. And then from there, though, I do believe the hockey community is very special in the sense that it rallies. And if we can humanize issues and engage and educate them, they will then shift behaviors, shift language, shift attitudes to the point that they will rally around these social issues. We saw it this summer where 200 players, whether it was some of them performative, some of them genuinely finally were opened their eyes to racism that exists. But after the murder of George Floyd, 200 or so players made statements. And we saw that. At that point, we could have educated them further if the resources were available to them. If we humanize LGBTQ+ for these players who are in this incredibly insular environment, they won't see it as a distraction anymore. The way they don't see cancer as a distraction, the way they don't see any of these other issues, and they will rally. We rallied around Humboldt, we rally around cancer, we rally in situations where people are struggling. The suicide rates, as Brian and Anne both mentioned, are exorbitantly high for this community. We can rally and help them and create a safer environment if we recognize the need. But that's the issue. Right now we see it as a distraction where the same amount of media attention will be laid on these other issues, and it's no big deal. We'll be empathetic, compassionate, and everything else. But with this, we go, oh, we don't want to deal with that. And that's where we have to shift.
Right. And let's go from media to social media. Obviously, it's this is something that no league, no player, no anybody would have to have dealt with 25 years ago. But we're into a reality now where social media has the ability to be exponentially crueler in attempts by people to deal with this issue. What have you noted in your research about this?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at social media, we've looked at it, and hopefully what we thought would be a positive for a lot of athletes, and it has been, right? It has certainly allowed athletes to create their own media platforms and have a presence. With that comes the downside, right? We've seen a lot of athletes face hate and face comments and threats against their life, which is just really crazy to me that people think they can do this. The extreme case would be Tom Daley, who was a diver for England in the games when they hosted, and he didn't win. He was gutted, as he said, and a young man threatened his life on Twitter. So they have laws in the UK, and he ended up being arrested. But really, we're talking about athletes. People follow athletes and think they know them. There's a thing called parasocial relationships, right? So I know Brock, but I'll pretend I don't know Brock. So I follow Brock on social media, and I think I see everything he does in his life, and I think we're friends. And so I have this parasocial relationship with him. And in doing that, I then think that I have the rights to say things to him or to, bring other people into a conversation. And so the downside is we've seen a lot more hate. And I think maybe in the last 4 years, given who was in the White House, we've seen it because he's used social media to target athletes and spread hate for the work that they're doing. So I'd like to think maybe it's going to get a little better with a different person in the White House in the United States, but it is a double-edged sword. So I think, from that, we need to make sure that young athletes, as they start to use these tools and use them in a way to build a business or a platform, they need to really have supports to understand how to deal with this. And coaches and out there, you can tell them to turn their phones off, put them away. Don't look at them between training and performance so that they don't get sucked into it. Unfortunately, it's just really become a part of who we are these days, that we feel we can sit at home on our couch and lob shots at whoever we want on Twitter or Facebook.
Steve, let me jump in real quick.
Please. Yeah.
Just one thing that should not be lost sight of is if you look at Anne's slides, and I'd like those slides, Anne, if you'd send me the deck, that's great. If you look at that and you say, man, we got a lot of work to do, the progress we've made, let's not lose sight of the fact that the progress that's been made on all of these fronts is significant and encouraging. And the change in my adult life, I'm optimistic about a lot of these things for the first time in my adult life, that we are going to remove some of these barriers. We are going to continue to progress as a country and as a nation. So let's not lose sight of the fact the progress has been phenomenal. It's not anywhere near where we need to go. And people got to listen to this. Like Anne said, act, speak, do it, get behind everything. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we're making progress. We're getting there. We just got to get there faster.
Well, let me do a follow-up with you, Brian, on that. And I don't mean this in a facetious way, but you know what I'm about to say is accurate. You tend not to give too much of a damn about what people think of you, and you're a strong individual. And I'm willing to bet that a bunch of people who are watching this right now either play hockey or have got kids in hockey. And if they were to hear somebody on their kid's team, or if they were to hear one of their fellow parents using a homophobic slur in referring to another player, they might not have the guts that you would have to go up to that person and say, hey, cut that crap out. We don't accept that here. So could you offer some advice to those people as to what that move that what Burkean move should they do that they might not feel they have the guts to do?
Well, there's a time when I might have slugged one of those parents, but now I'd probably just swear at them. I mean, the fact of the matter is, what Brock is describing about the language, it's not acceptable in any NHL dressing room or on the ice. I suspended the first player ever for a racial slur. Players have been suspended in multiple sports for homophobic language. It's not acceptable. So if it's not acceptable in an NHL dressing room, it's certainly not acceptable in the kids' room. That's got to be reported back to coaches. Brendan, in fact, his last year of high school, he did not play for his high school. He played for a town team, a lower level, had a gas. They won a championship of this garbage league, but they had a great bunch of kids and they had fun. Only afterwards did he tell me the reason he quit the high school team was because of the homophobic language in the dressing room. So there's no doubt when Brock tells me this, I don't doubt it anyway, because I've lived through it with my son. But the fact is, that's not acceptable anymore. And in Greater Toronto youth hockey, you can get suspended for any racial language. You can get suspended for any homophobic slur. You're going right down to below bantam level. So it's not acceptable anymore, and parents should report it, should not tolerate it. And you say Brock coaches use that language. Let's announce it to the world. Let's get them all fired.
I'm happy to sit down with you, Brian, and I'm happy to call them all out. Can I jump on to that, Steve?
Please do, Brock.
I think the biggest thing is I think people by nature are good. I think people are good people. I think sometimes whether they're, different belief systems, maybe due to religious or other reasoning, they may not agree or they may not recognize. And then in some situations, the language may come from being a product of an environment. To me, my biggest thing is we need to humanize these issues. If you hear stories of people and you recognize people in your life are going to be impacted, because the reality is I've yet to go anywhere and speak. The first question I ask, major corporate all the way down to a kindergarten class, is who here knows somebody who identifies part of this community? At least 90% of the hands go up. And then typically I'll ask, who here has used homophobic language? All the hands go up. But if they recognize that there's going to be, it's going to spread. It's a disease. That language is a disease and it spreads. And when we use it, and in hockey or in sport culture, if a junior player is using it and then an elite minor hockey player is practicing with the junior team or something, then they start using it and bring it down, and it has a trickle-down effect. Or if a pro is using it in the summer, skating with junior players and other pros, it shifts. And then that trickle ends up into mainstream society because they are influencers. And then eventually that person they know will hear it, may not come directly from them. But that's how that's in my opinion, how we get rid of the language is by recognizing and humanizing it. And if we engage with a parent who's using it or somebody at the arena and say, like, isn't your aunt or your sister or your cousin, don't you know somebody part of this community? Don't you think that'll impact them? So now you've put a face to it, you've humanized it, and then you've engaged with them and educated. To me, sometimes if we go with the same force they're going with, we're going to create barriers to communication, and we want to, limit those. And it's difficult at times. It's difficult for me. It's my life, and it can be emotional and passionate and everything else. But if we can, engage and educate people on this, we will see shifts. People are good by nature, and they will recognize the impact they're having on people's lives.
Okay, I'm noticing we're starting to get a lot of questions in the Q&A field at the bottom of the screen. So I think without further ado, we're going to start to get to those. Here's a Kevin McCarty who's asked, Brian, this one's for you. Before the pandemic, there was a controversy with the Blues foregoing a Pride Night on their special events calendar. What's your opinion on NHL Pride Nights and teams in the league not wanting to participate?
Well, I've never talked to the St. Louis Blues about why the reasons they did that or didn't do that. I don't know. I don't really care. I'm kind of like what Ann said earlier is, And what I said earlier about pride parades, and to me, I long for the day when we don't need pride nights, or it's super fan of the year night and it happens to be a gay person, great. But the notion that this distinct community, which now is fighting for recognition and respect and needs these parades and needs the support, and you gotta, there have to be pioneers in these things. So like Ann said earlier, I'm sick of talking about first this, first that. I'm not. I'll take them all. I'm with Ann. We should be well past this stage, but for now, I'm jumping up and down for every first. I'll vote for a second, a third, a fourth, and then at some point, we'll stop celebrating these things. But I don't know why the St. Louis Blues did it. I believe the NHL should mandate that every team host a Pride Night for the foreseeable future, certainly the next few years, and then let's see where we get as a society. But absolutely, to me, if I'm a GM, we do a Pride Night.
And here's a follow-up for you from Lindsay Holmes. How do we hold organizations we support, especially in the NHL, accountable? Lindsay says Pride Night isn't enough. What's your view on that?
That's for me also, Steve, sorry?
That's for Ann.
Oh, for Ann, good.
Well, I think Brian spoke really eloquently about why Pride Nights are still important. Holding organizations accountable. Let's go back to what he said at the beginning, Brian, when you talked about, you take, not only do you vote, you take the power, for me, the power of my purse and my wallet. Where do I take it? If organizations are not going to be inclusive, the difficulty we have in sports is we become fans and we're very highly attached to teams, and our identities become a part of being a fan of, the Toronto Maple Leafs or whatever team you're a fan of. You need to get beyond that part of your identity and make that action and that accountability side of the 3 steps of being an ally, and say, I can take my money and my fandom elsewhere. And if teams start to suffer, I think financially, they start seeing differences in their fans. They start having fans talk publicly about how disappointed they are in their organizations and saying how they're changing. They won't be a fan anymore. I think there's some power in doing that. So yeah, you have to hold them accountable and you have to get them to be more inclusive past Pride Nights. But Pride Nights are still important.
Brock, here's one for you from a Brendan Story. As a hockey player, what would be the most efficient way to make a difference?
Find a way amongst your peers, depending on your age or whatnot. I look at what my athletes did and the shifts they created by just engaging with amongst each other, and then using their social influence to bring it to their peers at school, to bring it to their teammates at the rink with the push-up challenge. And finding your own thing like that amongst your group is, in my opinion, more valuable than any night, any tape, any, event, because now you're creating shifts. Now you're creating shifts that go beyond performance, and as Ann talked about performative allyship in her presentation, and, it has substance and depth, and it's going to get people to, really, really change their behaviors. It's funny, I had a 19-year-old junior or 18-year-old junior hockey player, and he was just coming to U18 and went and played junior, and he actually moved to Toronto to play junior from Sudbury. And he texted me one day, his 3rd day down there, and he goes, I never believed you when you talked about hockey still having a long way to go. And he goes, because I never heard any of that language around my teams. He goes, but I came down here, and within the first half hour in the locker room, I heard every homophobic slur you could think of being thrown around without any care. He goes, but you were around, you shifted it. We need to humanize things, and we need to create those, and that kid was one of the kids that was doing the push-ups and everything else, and his teammates were as well. And if we can do that amongst these young people and recognize, and then, if they have that thing that goes, shoot, I did that, and it's a bad habit I got to change, then they will. So I think that's the best thing.
Brian, this next question is for you, and it's from a Brian De Wagner, who says, I work as a counselor in a school board, and being a former athlete, I get referred a lot of athletes, particularly hockey players. Discussions about the broken parts of the culture are always met with terribly defensive reactions and the doors shut fast on open conversations. Any tips on keeping those doors open to facilitate discussions without having to dumb down the discussion or back off of priority issues? It's a tough culture to crack. People don't want to go there, but we need to.
Oh, that's depressing. I want to mention one thing that none of us have mentioned, because we're speaking at a university level, and that's bullying. And we should never talk about this topic without talking about bullying. LGBTQ kids are bullied at a horrible rate. And that's something, that's not the purpose of this panel, but we should mention it. For any younger people, you have to intervene if you witness bullying, and if you can't, if the bullies are too big or there's too many of them, you have to report it. It's an issue that disproportionately affects LGBTQ kids, boys and girls, more boys. So that's something we should never have a conversation like this without mentioning that. Going back to what you said, that's pretty depressing what you just said to me, Brian, because to me, it's 2020. And I know it's a terrible year in many ways, but in many ways, it's been a year of change on the fronts of social justice and LGBTQ rights, and women's advancement. Like, I see so many bright signs, even though I'm sick of 2020. I can't wait for it to end, but I see so many rays of sunlight. So I would say just stay with it. Use some of this evidence that, that we're talking about, and just try and change people's views one at a time. And sometimes it might be you'd have to say to a couple of these parents, let's sit down and talk about this. Or a couple of players, get them in a group and get someone in there that's got a positive IQ.
And here's one for you. This is from an anonymous attendee. How can someone who is not directly part of the hockey or sport community help and support the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I mean, there's lots of ways you can support. So here's a good example. It's not LGBTQ, but it's an organization that I think's done a lot. It wasn't part of hockey, but was a group of fans. And there's a group called the Black Girls Hockey Club, and that group has created a space for Black women to be fans of hockey. But beyond that, they've created a space for individuals who love the game of hockey to demand change, and they've got very vocal. They have an amazing leader, and I think they're doing really good work. So I can see groups like that. The power of fans in sport is pretty big. So you may not be directly play hockey, coach hockey, participate, but if you consume sport in some way, your fandom is important to teams. And organizing groups and providing a space for individuals who are like-minded to come together has a lot of power inside sport.
What's the name of that group again?
Black Girls Hockey Club.
And what city are they out of?
They're in the States. Brock, you know, right?
Yeah, Renee is based, I believe, in who runs in Missouri, but they're everywhere. Like they're just what they've done is it started off as Renee Hess, the founder of it, was a hockey fan, and she was, I believe, a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, and she'd go to games, and she noticed she was the only Black person there, and more specifically, Black woman. And she went, there's got to be more of me out here. And she has been immersed. She teaches in the space of fandoms at a college level, I believe. And she's created this group, and it's Black women getting together and going to games. And then it's become even bigger where, players, Joel Ward dropped a puck and wore their hoodie, and NHL players are coming to them and saying, I wish my mom had this when she was struggling, when I was the only Black kid on the team as a kid, and they looked at us when we were so different. And their impact, and the impact Renee has had by creating this, is like profound. They're so well organized. It's all about them. It's about giving space and empowering and working on healing and dealing with, the aspects, the intersectionality of being a Black woman in a white space that is hockey, and giving them, opportunity to flourish and grow. Now they have scholarships and they have different things. They're brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant.
Brian, here's the next one for you. This is from an attendee who wanted to remain anonymous. The person says, Brian, if you were still a general manager in the league today, are there any players in the league that you would not allow to play for your team because of their non-progressive views, or would you still acquire them with the hopes of educating them?
Well, first off, I think players are entitled to have viewpoints. You know, First Amendment in the U.S. guarantees that we've always tolerated it in Canada. So I have not focused on that in terms of acquiring players. I do require my players to act a certain way. And so it would be a challenge for me. I know there are players very far right wing where I am. I would tend to stay away from them. But basically, I think a player has a right to be what I consider ignorant, as long as he acts appropriately in front of his teammates and in front of the fans and in front of the public. So to me, use the right language, act the right way, say the right things. But I've never tried to dictate what a player, and I've never tried to dictate what players do politically. I did early in my career because I worried about things. But then as I realized they have a voice, they have a platform, they can make a difference, we actually encourage them to now. So there are players I definitely would not acquire on that basis, but they shall remain nameless tonight.
I know this isn't the right sport, but could Curt Schilling play for you?
It would be hard. That would be a hard one for me.
Even though maybe he's a Hall of Famer.
Yep.
So then I guess Aubrey Huff's a no-go.
Go ahead, Brock. Tell us what Aubrey said the other day.
I've muted him a while ago. His conspiracy theories are too out there for me.
You gotta have standards on people. I don't hire certain people on the business side. I don't bring certain players in on the hockey side. I practice what I preach. I live a lifestyle, and I insist on certain standards being met in my organizations. So yes, it would be a problem with certain players. I'm not going to name. I know a couple that I could name right now, but I will tell you this: I would hope when I was still managing, I was hoping the first player who came out would come out on my team, because I think we could defend and protect him the best of any team.
Just curious on this follow-up here, Brian, and you're going to help me with the name. I think it was Andrew Shaw from the Montreal Canadiens. Did I have that name right?
Who
used a homophobic slur in the middle of a game, and then, I guess, what's the expression? I guess took some sensitivity training, understood what he did, and has become a kind of a goodwill ambassador for this issue. You think that's the right way to handle this thing? Or is naming and shaming a better way to go?
I think you suspend the player and then get him whatever help he needs. I think players need to be suspended for homophobic slurs, and they are. So to me, I think people deserve a second chance, and I know Brock will agree. The use of homophobic language is not a judgment in most cases about the other player's sexuality. It's a reflexive, habitual, harmful remark. Guy just bumped you from behind. You're mad. You're picking up the biggest rock you can throw at it. And unfortunately, in our game, historically, that's a homophobic slur. You're not saying to yourself, geez, I think that guy's gay. You're just throwing the biggest rock you can at him. That being said, it's harmful. It passes on to younger players. It's got to stop. It has to stop.
Well, and this is a good follow-up for you. Cassandra Cowan asks, how does one rid themselves of their own learned biases and behaviors and reflect on their bias to move forward more progressively?
Yeah, I think we're all doing that. So, I've spent a lot of time this summer reading and educating myself to get through some implicit biases that you're not even sure you have, but you do, right? And so you spend the time and you educate. I think the first step is asking that question. Knowing that you even ask that question is a great first step. You're recognizing that it exists, and that now you've got to get some time to educate yourself, and then you got to get uncomfortable. And that really is the time to say, like, I've got some privilege. And at times it's really easy just to skate through life on the privilege that you have, and being able to pass that up and walk away from some inopportunity. So I was in a workshop today, and somebody said they really wish that white people would stop opportunity hoarding. And I thought that's a great terminology, that sometimes our privilege just affords us opportunities to do things that we should open the door and let others do. So first I would say is the first step is you've asked the question. The second one is educate, read yourself, and be prepared to be uncomfortable, because with uncomfortableness will come some change for you. There's tests you could do about implicit bias that to confirm it, but I think we could all just sort of start from the the understanding that all of us possess some sort of implicit bias.
Well, and let me play devil's advocate and push back on that just for the purposes of our discussion here tonight.
Sure.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I bet a heck of a big chunk of the 47.5% of people who voted for Donald Trump, whatever it was, 2 weeks ago, I bet a lot of them thought, I'm not a racist, but I'm sick and tired of people telling me that I am a racist because I'm just not as progressive as they want me to be. And I don't feel I should be made to feel uncomfortable for and Brock's not going to like this line, but for the quote unquote normal views that I hold about the world. What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I try not to talk to people who maybe voted that way. That's a good place to start. But listen, I mean, there's a lot of people in my timeline on social media in the last 2 months who are basically saying, if you're voting for this individual, you're voting to accept racism, you're voting to accept homophobia, you're voting to accept misogyny, because he's proven over and over again with his language and his actions that these are his beliefs. And whether, he does it because he firmly believes it, I do believe he does, but he also does it to stir his base up. And so if you're saying that you're voting because you think he's better for the economy, I think you need to take a look at the actual facts on that. He certainly hasn't been better for the health of the Americans. So I think that's just an easy way to say, yeah, I'm not racist because I'm voting for another issue. I would almost say it's like, I'm not racist because I have Black friends. It equates to that for me. And so you can play devil's advocate, but for me, I'm not sure I would enter into conversations with people that don't have the ability to step back and realize what they just said is completely ludicrous.
Okay, Brock, this one's for you, again from an anonymous attendee. He says, or she says, thank you for educating and speaking to us all about your experiences. Here comes the question. Have you ever felt that this secrecy has impacted your performance as a professional player? And once out, have you noticed an improvement on a professional level?
Well, it definitely did have an impact on, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence from the age of 15 until I stopped playing at 30, I had a season-ending injury every year. Every single season, I had a major injury that cost me the year, and I believe a lot of that was psychosomatic. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that my mental health was in a rough spot. I wasn't sleeping. Through junior, I was drinking regularly. And I was suicidal. So when you factor all that in, yeah, you're not going to be able to perform to your best of your ability. And I believe to this day that hockey got 60% of me at best, maybe even less. And I think that had to do with the fact that I didn't feel like I could be myself in it. And unfortunately for me, and in hindsight, I came out after I retired. Which, I'm sad that I did, because if I would have told my parents at 15 years old, and I would have worked with a therapist, and because I have the privilege to be able to, and I would have had, the support system around me to live as my authentic self and, play the sport I love, I think I would have been happier. I think hockey would have been, it's ironic because hockey was the only place on the ice, was the only place where I didn't think about it, where it didn't matter.
But do you think you would have had a career in the National Hockey League had you not had to deal with this?
I believe, there's so many variables that can, that could come into play, but I was ranked on NHL draft lists. I've put up 930 save percentages at points in the OHL. I was a top goalie in a professional league in Europe, all the while cutting myself and drinking every night. So yeah, I think I would have played in the NHL, and I got into a disagreement about politics and some of this stuff with a player that probably one of the players Brian said he won't mention not that long ago. And he said, you're just mad because you didn't make the show. And I look back and I say, it's funny. I am so proud of the career I had, considering all the hurdles and obstacles that I had to deal with. So do I think I would have played in the NHL? 100%. I had the drive, I had the work ethic, and I had the ability.
Brian Burke, here's a question for you from someone named Donald Edwards. As an ally and a coach, how would you start this discussion with a high school hockey team? Brock mentioned humanizing the situation. How do you humanize it in the dressing room?
Well, I think you humanize it, like Brock said, by asking that question, first day of practice, how many of you have a gay relative or friend? And it will be pretty significant. And how many of you use I like that. I didn't hear this part of Brock's speech till tonight. I like that. I'm going to use that. But I think the other way is just, you've got to have strict rules on what's acceptable and what's not. And hockey players love discipline. They love rules. They live by a schedule. It's the only profession that's more regimented is the military. But if you're a hockey player, and Brock knows this, is the bus leaves at 9:30. Well, guess what? If you're not on the bus at 9:30, it ain't waiting for you. It's going. And it's time frames and rules. And I think that what's really important is this is unacceptable. This kind of conduct is unacceptable, not only in our dressing room, but on the ice to opponents. These are the words we don't say. These are the things we do. We stick together if a player is insulted. So I think real clear rules, but I like Brock's way of humanizing that and saying this is, we do not, it's one thing, you have to live by certain principles. And if you say, I don't care who you come to the rink with, I don't care who you leave with, I don't care where you go to church, I don't care where you shop, I don't care what color your skin is, you've got to live that out. And I think it's important that teams establish those rules. What are we about? What is our team about? Are we a team with a conscience? Are we a team with a polar star that we believe in and principles that we follow? And that's what I would talk about.
Can I jump on that quickly, Steve?
Please, Brock. Yep.
To your point, Brian, and one thing I would add to it, or a couple things, is beyond the relative or whatnot, and you both, Ann and Brian, spoke earlier about financial implications and where you spend your money, etc. There's an impact on winning. There's an impact on winning because the reality is, in those rooms, there's somebody that was like me. And the sport got 60% of my ability. Even if you're homophobic and you hate the LGBTQ plus community, your teammate might be gay and you want to win that game tonight. And if you're putting that person down, or you're acting in a manner that doesn't make them feel comfortable, they're not playing to their ability. And it's going to impact your team. And if you're there for your team, and that's why you're at the rink, to win hockey games, then you have to make an inclusive space so that everyone feels comfortable. And I do a breakout exercise now on conformity within the sport, where if we break those barriers of conformity and we all end up being those weirdos, and we share things we wouldn't typically share with a teammate that we enjoy, it'll get us to that space where we're less judgmental and we recognize. Because the reality was, I was the womanizing hockey bro sitting beside my teammates who were calling people fags. But in reality, I was the guy inside that was struggling with my sexuality. And if we, eliminate that language, those behaviors, and those thoughts from the game, your team's going to play better. Period. End of story.
Well, Brian, I don't mean to put you on the spot with this question, and you won't feel that way anyway. But I am curious, if the choice for you were, you could be the manager of that team that had the first out athlete in NHL history, but it would mean that you'd have to give up that Stanley Cup ring. So you'd go down in history for having done this, but you'd never get your name engraved on the cup. Is that a trade you'd make?
You know what? I don't think I have to make that trade. I really believe you could do both. I really believe that I could have had a player come to me and say, Berkey, I'm gay. And I would have put my arm around him and said, okay, what do we do next? How do you want to proceed? You want to come out to the team? Your parents know, and just walk through the process and make it as seamless as possible. And then say to the team, we got a rallying point here. This is a rallying point. We're going to do the right thing for our teammate here. But to be honest, answer your question, go back as starkly as you asked it. Would I trade being a trailblazer in that way for my cup? Yes, I would.
In a game where it's all about winning and only about winning?
Not only about winning in my life. I'm proud of, I look at the players that work for me. I look at the players I started in coaching careers. I look at the people I gave them their first job and what they've gone on to be and had the right conscience and the right morals. I look at the influence I've had on the people who work for me, the players that have worked for me that have gone on to become coaches and become GMs and become good fathers and become doctors and lawyers. I look at the impact I've had on my young men, and I take great pride in that. So it's not just about winning. I remember Jackie Parker, who was a great coach at Boston University. They asked him once, what was his greatest team? He said, I don't know yet, because I don't know what those guys are all going to be in 20 years.
That's a great answer. That's my alma mater, incidentally. Okay. Amy Henson has a question, and this is for you. There have been a lot of issues in transgender people fighting for rights in sport. How do we battle this and move forward in the traditional binary sport world that exists?
Yeah, that's probably one of the top issues we're dealing with in sport, and I would say maybe I wouldn't use the word battle. I think we need to really take the time to look at all the issues around it. I'd say in research, we haven't got there yet. We haven't got enough research, because that's where I always go to, the data that shows one way or the other. Because basically there's a couple pieces of research out there, and each side on this debate grabs them and uses them in their own way. And so it's particularly only an issue predominantly in women's sport, where trans athletes have got the right inclusive in Canada to play, and in other jurisdictions. We do have an international rugby ban. The International Rugby Union has just put a ban out for trans athletes, whereas Canadian Rugby is still upholding their inclusiveness policy. So I think we have a ways to go. As Brian said, we've come a long way, and as we make steps forward in each one of these, we're learning from them. And it is difficult because we do have a binary system, but we've been able to do this with Paralympic sport and find a way to be inclusive of all different individuals in that sport. So I'm confident that we are going to find the right way to be inclusive for trans athletes and continue to support their pursuit of sport.
Let me do a follow-up question, and Brock and Brian, I'll put this one to you, and you'll forgive me for a second. I'm going to just move over to an area that I feel a little more comfortable in, and that's politics, which I've covered for about 40 years. And you mentioned Glenn Murray, who's a former minister in the Ontario government, the first openly gay politician, I think, in, certainly the first openly gay mayor in North American history, and an openly gay member of Dalton McGuinty's cabinet in the province of Ontario. And I remember asking him once, after Kathleen Wynne became the first openly gay premier in Canadian history, how could she do it? How did she do it? If all of the homophobia out there, and yet here's Kathleen Wynne and she wins a majority government. And his answer to me was, the public are more willing to accept an openly gay woman as opposed to an openly gay man. There is something about being an openly gay man that is still a bridge too far for too many people, whereas for an openly gay woman, it isn't. Okay, what's the question? The question is, would it be easier, Brock, for an openly gay female hockey player to come out than for an openly gay male hockey player to do so?
Yeah, and before I go there, can I, this isn't, I don't mean this as any disrespect, Steve, to the whole thing, but one way that we can start shifting things for trans people is stop referring to sports as male and female and say men and women. And that in itself is because, will make people more inclusive and supported. And it goes to less about biology and more about who they are. So if we say men's sport and women's sport, we've already started a small shift towards making it more inclusive for trans people. I think that that question about whether it's in politics or whether it's in society is loaded in sport. I do believe that it's probably it's probably easier to be a gay woman, only because this goes back to like the patriarchy and different things where straight men, if you look at the slide Anne had earlier, and it was a group of 10 to 12 straight men sitting on Hockey Canada's board, right? Well, the odds are they are more comfortable with the idea of two women because that might be sexually appealing to them. So it's almost been normalized in culture for a very long time, whereas the idea of two men together might bring up thoughts of disgust in their minds. So let's start there and then take it from there. And then sport being as hypermasculine as it is, especially team sports, leads to unfair stereotypes in the opposite way, that if you're a woman in sport, you are automatically a lesbian, because how else can you play a manly sport? And to the points earlier that Brian made about players putting each other down and using that type of language. Typically, players are put down by using sexist language or homophobic language. And it's not because they think that player necessarily is, but it's this idea that a man is here. And whether they recognize it or not, it's essentially what they're doing. And being a woman or a gay man means you're less hypermasculine, thus you're down here on that hierarchy. Right. So now we're seeing almost the opposite in some women's sports, where women are hyperfeminizing themselves. Like, you'll see athletes with full makeup on in a game, and some do it because they love it, but some do it because there's a stereotype that comes with, playing women's team sports, that they are presumed to be a lesbian until proven straight, and the opposite in men's. So I think the patriarchy, different, social norms, acceptance within society has led us down a road where it is more and easier, more comfortable for men who typically are at the top of corporations or at the top of politics or at the top of sport to be comfortable with the idea of two women than two men.
Yeah, one of my biggest jobs tonight is to make sure we get finished on time. So Brian, let me give you the last word on this, and then I've got some wrap-up comments I've got to make.
Well, on this, I would agree with everything Brock said. I would go much farther out on that limb, though. I think it's far easier for a female athlete to come out, or a woman athlete, sorry, Brock, a women's athlete to come out. I think you can play, even the you can play umbrella. We realized the drop-off rates of gay athletes in male team sports were much higher than for women's team sports. And so I'd say everything Brock said is true. I would just have a much stronger answer on it, where I say, yes, what that politician said, in my mind, is unquestionably true. And again, it's got to change.
Anne, you want a last word on that?
I sort of wonder, were you going to ask the woman about it? I do think we've come further in women's sports of accepting. I mean, if you've watched any women's sports this summer and watched the amazingness of Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe, I think they've made life brighter for a lot of young women who are questioning their sexuality, and I applaud them for that. Look, I grew up in a time it wouldn't have been easy, to be honest. I certainly wasn't. I wasn't an out athlete in any way. It came much later in life for me, but I remember I played basketball, and I can tell you there was rules: no lesbians in our teams. There's famous women coaches in the U.S. who wouldn't recruit them. And so we've got to think that while we've come further in women's sport, and it is a bit easier and maybe a bit more acceptable, it's still not easy. And we still have young athletes out there struggling. So I don't want everyone to think, oh, it's just more acceptable, and not deal with those athletes that might be on their teams as well. So I think we need to be aware of that. But I do think we have women's sport leading the way in so many ways this summer, with social justice movements, and the WNBA as an example. And one of the reasons I think that those women led is the vast majority of them are Black women, and quite a large number of them are lesbians. And so they already know what it's like to fight every single day with those intersectionalities, and throw in fact that they play women's sport, which gets 4% of media coverage and has some of the worst conditions and not a livable wage. They're used to being at the front of social justice. So I do think that women's sport affords that, and we see these women leading the way. But I just want to be aware that we still have young athletes out there, and some even listening tonight, that it's not super easy for them, and we need to provide supportive environments for everyone.
And I didn't mean to minimize it at all in that regard, because even somebody Brian knows really well, Anastasia Busis, and I did a documentary we were both in it, and she struggled a lot, and women do struggle within the culture.
Friends, humor me for another minute as I have these wrap-up comments here, because part of the wonderful thing that Dan Andreae does, besides sponsoring this lecture as he has for so many years, is also a gift to the university that includes funds to support a student scholarship. And we want to acknowledge, let's put on the record right now, that this year's recipient of the Dr. Dan Andreae Living in Healthy Community Scholarship is Joelle Belanger for her excellence inside and outside of the classroom. Joelle is a fourth-year kinesiology student, a former hockey player who identifies as Métis. She's currently coaching for the Nickel City Suns Minor Atom AA, that's under 11 hockey team in Sudbury, working with 16 boys and 1 girl, and she is working to change athletes' perception of what defines a good hockey coach regardless of gender. Her efforts to change hockey culture from the so-called old boys network to a more inclusive environment are commendable and obviously very important given the conversation we've had tonight. Dr. Dan, I want to thank you for the good work that you do and for making all this happen tonight. We want to thank Laurentian University for hosting it, and Pegoraro, Brian McGillis, Brock McGillis and Brian Burke. You've given us so much to think about tonight. And Brian, I sure hope you're not sick of me, because I just found out today that I get to interview you on the agenda soon about your new book, Burke's Law, which we are happy to recommend. It is a bestseller in the country already. And I remember, was it Gene Barry? Was he the host of that TV show? Is that where the title of the book comes from?
Yeah, I think he was. It's an old 60s detective show, I think, but I think it was Gene Barry.
I remember it well. In any event, it's been a great night, and I want to thank everybody, not only for the participation of our panelists, but for the nearly 200 people who stuck it out with us right till 9 o'clock. And as we always do when I host, we get off on time. So thank you, everybody, and good night.